Hello and welcome to the People Pleaser podcast. That is a tongue twister. My name is Corey and I am your host. So this is episode 2. If you haven't already, please, when you find 7 minutes of your time, listen to episode 1. I think I do a pretty good job of giving a broad outline of what you can expect from this podcast because today I am just diving right in. But before I get into the nitty-gritty of this episode, I do want to take these first few moments just to set the stage a little bit and share where my head is at as I record, and what direction I plan on heading as I move forward with this podcast. As I mentioned in my first episode, it's really important to me that I share real-life examples of times where I have fallen into people-pleasing patterns. And in order to do that in the way that I feel the most connected to, I will inevitably be talking about scenarios involving other people because, as you can probably imagine, it's really hard to be a people pleaser all on your own. And so to maintain the safety and respect for others, I will be leaving these stories anonymous unless I have been given explicit consent to share names. I can't say for certain that all these scenarios that I do intend to share have been completely resolved and wrapped up with a nice little bow. That is the ideal, but that's certainly not the reality. So it's not to say that I have figured out people pleasing. That's really important for me to make really clear. I am not an expert. This is me truly taking you along for the journey. I'm in the weeds right now. I'm in the thick of it. And, I think that's a really cool place to be. And so I also just want to make it a little more explicit that this is really just meant to be a conversation. I am not taking on the role of an expert or an educator on the topic of people pleasing. What's kind of hilarious is that I do work as a counselor, and this is a topic that I support many clients with. But the saying goes, a painter's house is never painted. Yeah, so it is important for me to emphasize that no information from this podcast should be used or taken as prescriptive advice, but more so just as an opportunity to share and maybe just relate into one another. And before we get really started, I think it might be helpful to create a little bit of a working definition of people pleasing, because I just want to make sure we're launching into this journey together with a similar working definition. And my hope is that through sharing stories and more anecdotal notes that will strengthen and broaden the definition a little bit. But as a starting point, I'm just going to read what I read on the internet. So, people pleasing involves speaking and behaving to accommodate the emotional needs of others, typically to the detriment of your own well-being. Common signs of a people pleaser include poor boundaries, struggling to say no, and constantly apologizing. So that is just a good starting point for us. And I think it's also really important to start with a bit of a working definition for boundaries, because boundaries and people pleasing they rub up against each other quite often. So for the sake of a starting point, the definition of boundaries is the physical or emotional limits that a person defines as safe or appropriate. And what's really important to emphasize is that boundaries are very personal and they can really change depending on the situation or the context. So loosely, when I'm talking about people pleasing and boundaries, that's sort of what we're working with, but I hope to really add more to that. Today, what I want to focus this episode on is my thoughts on where my people-pleasing may have originated from, or at least some key markers that may have led to where I am today. I don't think it's as easy as it was XYZ, and that's what created my people-pleasing. It's way messier than that. But I think that I do have a bit of a sense of why I may be more susceptible to these behavioral patterns. So here we go. I want to start by looking at my parents. Not that I'm holding my parents responsible in any real way, but our parents upbringing influences the way oftentimes that they then raise their children. So when I think about how I was raised, I can't help but wonder how my parents were raised. And there's actually information about the way my parents were raised that I do think really does lend to this conversation. So we'll start with my dad. My dad was born in 1948, so this is like post World War II. He grew up in Toronto, and he grew up with a mother who was quite absent. I guess we could call her an alcoholic. Certainly struggled with substance use. Now, I don't have any context to her mental health, anything of the sort, but what I understand is that my grandmother was not able to care for my father, and so he ended up being taken in by his grandmother, so my great grandmother. And I mean, that was a true blessing. It was an amazing thing that my great grandmother was able to bring my dad in. But what that ended up doing is, they were living in poverty. Essentially, he said they lived in a cold water flat, which I think the title says it all. I think there was only cold water. There were multiple people in the home, and it also separated my dad from his youngest sister. So it really was quite like a traumatic event, even though he's never described it as that. But if I can kind of think about the impacts of what that might have done to a young person, even just the confusion, that placemaking, not knowing where you belong, I think that can really have a long-lasting effect. Now, my dad, he left Toronto and set out for the West Coast, and there's a lot that I'm not going to get into, like the whole story, but what I want to really talk about is my perception of my dad as I was growing up. My perception of my dad was that he needed to be cared for, that he was not okay, that financially he was struggling, romantically he was struggling to make ends meet. I never really knew what he did for jobs. Like, I never knew my dad to have one steady job. I knew that he accessed social assistance, and there was a lot of things that as a kid, like, you don't understand what's going on, and it's not our job to understand what's going on, but you can really pick up on the emotional weight of some of these circumstances. And there's so much context to my dad's life and well-being that I will never fully understand. But that is my first example of me at the youngest age I can imagine, like maybe even as young as like 5 or 6 years old, where I was worried about my dad. I was worried about him. And I assumed a bit of a people-pleasing or caregiving role to my dad because I wanted to make sure he was okay. Because if my dad was okay, then I was okay. So it was very, very, there was a codependence there. And the added layer to that is that I didn't grow up in the same household as my dad. So my parents always maintained a really good relationship and maintained, I bounced between both on a regular schedule. That was very secure. But I spent most of my time at my mom's, and that lended to me wondering and worrying about my dad a lot. And I can remember conversations where, my dad couldn't make it to see me. He couldn't find a car. Like, there's just so much to his world that just felt complicated. And I just wanted to take all that away. And maybe that was in my little brain. It was really to get my own needs met. As much as I did truly care for my dad's well-being, I think at that age, it's like you just want stability. You want consistency. You're really craving that. And so I was trying to will that into being. So that's, I think, a pretty big part of this. If I look at my mom and my mom's side, like my mom has been such a solid rock in my life. However, I do think it's important to just consider the context that my mom was raised by her mom and dad, and her mom had her at the age of 16. And by the time my grandmother turned 20, she had 3 daughters, and then years later, another son. So my mom left home at a really young age. I know that there was conflict between my grandma and grandfather that ended up in divorce, and my grandmother remarried, and like then there's bringing in the stepfather, and there's so much there that does influence my mom's sense of safety and security. And those early examples of like attachment and feeling secure, you can't deny that there was impacts along the way. And so my mom and I, we have such an open relationship, and we talk really openly about these types of things. And I think we're both kind of in this quest of wanting to just take good care of ourselves. We want to be healthy, happy, grounded individuals, and we are beginning to kind of unpack these more historical situations and events. So that's all I'll really say about my mom and dad, because there's a lot that I just don't know. And it's not about going through everything with a fine-tooth comb and being like, this is why. Like, I'm not trying to get to that aha moment necessarily. I'm just trying to be really curious about, that may be part of this. But what I really want to get to is like more of my life and where I first started seeing it. So I definitely first started seeing it in my relationship with my dad. And, even now, like I have this real soft spot for, like, this is going to sound really, really random, but like elderly men. And there's this sense of like, oh, they're so helpless. And I don't think we need to go down that rabbit hole too far, but I think that is still kind of, that lives on in me around, the way that I worried about my dad. So the other piece that I think I want to kind of dig into a little bit more right now is, so because of my family system and the dynamic in that I was mostly raised by, my mom was a single mom. Like, I lived with just her for a number of years before she married my stepdad, Joe. And so I did really identify as an only child. And the result of that was that I was actually in the care of a lot of programs and care providers. So because of my mom worked full time, I would often be in before school care. So I would go to like a program before school started. And then of course I'd be in school, and then I'd go to after school programs, and then a lot of different day camps, summer camps, things like that. So I got really familiar with people in helping roles. And those were some of the first people that I looked up to. Those were some of the first people that I was like, wow, like I want to be you when I grow up. And the irony, or the absolute hilarity of it all, is that I did actually, one of my first jobs was to actually go and work in the after school program that I was once in as a child. So I really saw that one through. But I think when I began to kind of idolize these people, it was not only because they were fun and cool and young, they were probably all in their like early 20s at the time, but I just looked up to them so much. But they were also in these like caregiving, like nurturing, helping roles. And I think I just felt so supported by them and so held by them in a way where I just really, I guess I embodied that. Like I then wanted to give that back. And I learned that felt so good. that I too wanted to care for others. And the thing that really sticks out to me that honestly makes me cringe, because it's so, at this point, it's just so big and out there, but you know, when people are like, so what do you want to be when you grow up? I don't remember what age I started to say this. I want to say like maybe 12 or 13. When people would say like, oh, Corey, what do you want to be when you grow up? I would say, I want to save the world. And I just thought like, oh, that was such a brilliant answer. Like, I am just such a, I don't know. Now I'm seeing it as like, oh, I had like a savior complex, and we really got to unpack that. But from a very young age, I felt like I have this role in the world to like give and provide and make people feel better. And I think this has really morphed into some of my people pleasing. Like, don't get me wrong, there are so many good qualities that exist in all of this that I'm really glad that I have. Empathy, compassion, like I'm a good listener. Like, there's a lot of really good stuff here. But I think the thing with people pleasing is that it can actually start really well intentioned. It can be subtle, that you begin to just take on more and more, to the point where you've lost balance. The scales are completely out of whack, and you've gone into the deep end. So I don't know if that's clear. There's so much more to that overall picture of my background, and I'm sure that as we go along, I'll think of more. But those are like when I really first started thinking about, where did this come from? Where did my people-pleasing tendencies come from? I was quickly brought back to thinking about my parents. I was quickly brought back to these like caregivers in my life that I really idolized and looked up to. And then that like cringeworthy, like I want to save the world type complex that felt so real to me. And this may be a bit of an aside, but that commitment, or that like, I don't even know what you would call it, that affirmation that I was like going to save the world, that has really messed with my brain, because it now has kind of created this like, am I ever doing enough? And I think that can really feed into people pleasing, when you think that, oh my God, I have to do such grandiose things. I have to save the world in order to have importance, have significance, have an impact. And I think it's really time to start teasing that apart. And for me, like getting clear on what is the safe, the healthy way of approaching a goal like saving the world. Like, I mean, no one's figured out how to save the world, like in so many areas, socially, environmentally, like we're a mess. But to feel that weight on my shoulders at such a young age has definitely skewed my way of thinking, and skewed my way of seeing success, seeing fulfillment, seeing purpose, because it just feels like I have this big goal. Even though I haven't said that in years, there's still a residual connection to that. And I mean, clearly I was able to access that memory very quickly, so it's not that far away. So as we move along, I am hoping to just kind of have these conversations. I can't say that I know where they're going to end up, and that's kind of cool. It's kind of cool to just free flow. I don't know how to do this yet, but I would really welcome any type of feedback or conversation. I mean, even just as like a people pleaser, like, do you like my podcast? So silly. I have to be so intentional with this, because as you set out, and for me, as I create things, it's hard to create things without like a bit of a sounding board, or to know like, is this landing, or like, am I way off the mark here? So I guess Instagram would be the best place to kind of connect and have conversations. If there are any questions, feedback, I just ask that you be nice to me. And I do sense that anyone that is going to be listening to the People Pleaser podcast, we're probably like-minded folks. So I don't actually have any real fears there. So please, if you have a thought, if you have a question, you are so encouraged and welcome to reach out to me on the peoplepleaser.pod Instagram account. So that's just peoplepleaser, all one word, .pod. I will be hanging out in the DMs. I will be trying to create content to make that a bit more of an intentional space for community and sharing. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, and I do hope to connect with you in and outside of the pod world. Bye, everybody.